Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be looking at religion once again, like we did earlier in this course. And we're going to be speaking about a second great awakening. So, in the same time period that we're seeing a market economy evolve, we're seeing people move westward, we're also going to see, once again, religious revival in America. One of the things that I want you to think about is if you were going out west in 1800, what would be there in Ohio or Indiana? Yes, probably you would see existence of native people, but perhaps not. Perhaps they'd already moved on west. They conceded their land to the US government. You might find very little what we would call civilization. There would be no schools, there'd be no church, there'd be no businesses. You would be creating a farm, cutting down the trees, creating it all anew. And for thousands and thousands of Americans, certainly after the American Revolution, beginning in the 1790s, they found themselves out west, creating all new lives. And one of the things that they had to create for themselves was places of faith. And so we will see a huge religious revival that begins because of this westward expansion. It will continue on for about 30 years and will eventually end up becoming reform movements. So people will be inspired. Essentially, they will put the faith that they gain in their childhood into practice as adults. And we can see that this idea that America is a culture, certainly a Protestant culture, evolves in this time. It becomes, for some people, a touchstone as a part of American identity. So the image on your screen that you're looking at is actually one from a children's biblical primer that was used for Sunday school in the 1850s. But you can get a sense that people are trying to teach lessons to young people that the church, the house of God, their faith should be central. And from there, they will be able to make choices. Hopefully, they will make good choices and walk down the path towards education, a life of success, a life with strong family and values, or they might make it on a different path. And that path is filled with choices that might lead them to all sorts of sinful behavior. One set of choices and path leads you to everlasting life. The other leads you to everlasting punishment. But this particular lesson was called The Way of Good and Evil, and trying to teach a lesson to young children that faith was a choice and that faith was action. And those will be themes that we have today in our lesson. So with the Second Great Awakening, as I said, our causes are really going to begin with this westward migration after the American Revolution. But there's also going to be kind of an evolution in American identity. In creating that second plan of government, the Constitution, we see that there's this movement towards this idea that America is an experiment and it is something that can be destined for perfection. And there's this idea of perfectionism, that there has been this opportunity, perhaps God-given to Americans, to create a society that isn't somehow tarnished with all the other sins of older civilizations back in Europe. We also are going to see, much like throughout American history, that there are times where there will be reactions to the previous movement. And one of those reactions will be to the Enlightenment itself, that there's only so much rationalization. At some point, there are unanswered questions. And perhaps, especially for those who were moving out west, there was a desire to find something more, and that emotional connection will bring people to faith and creating new churches. So with the Second Great Awakening, much like the first, it's a Protestant revival movement. So although we might see other churches grow, the vast majority of new adherents, new churches being built, and new faiths being created are coming out of this Protestant tradition. The Baptist and Methodist churches, which were created during the First Great Awakening, they will see their numbers to continue to increase. And if you look around today, particularly in the American South, you'll see a large number of Baptist churches. If you go north of the Ohio River, you will see a good number of Methodist churches in places like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan. And again, you do see a splitting or a convergence of these different religious traditions based on region. And we will see that will also tie into some of the other social issues of the day. But there were a lot of people who believed that we were ushering in a new era of humanity, that this American experiment had kind of begun to take hold, that this idea of westward expansion was a reality, and that people were very hopeful and they were looking to continue to create a better society. And they believed faith was a way to do that. For people who moved out west, and west being Ohio, as you can see on our map, or Kentucky or Indiana, there were no churches. If I went to live out in southern Ohio in 1800, I was going to have to build the church. I was going to have to bring the minister. And so, especially starting around 1801, you begin to see what were known as revivals or camp meetings. So for people who did settle out west, especially if they couldn't attend church on a regular basis, there became these annual religious celebrations. And they were called camp meetings because you literally had to camp. You were going to go there and you were going to wait for a large crowd to gather. There would be different ministers there who would be preaching. You would have choir contests. If you'd gotten engaged and you needed to be married by a minister, you went to the camp meeting, so that would happen. These celebrations lasted weeks, typically in the summer months or early fall. And for some people, this became something that they attended year after year. The Cane Ridge Revival still exists today, certainly not with 40,000 people as it once did in the early 1800s. But they became really the beginnings of how religion will be settled in the West. So I could go to Cane Ridge. Other people that I know in near my area, maybe within about 10 miles, might also be there. And if we decide to put our money together and maybe our time and try to build a church, we may want to hire ourselves a minister. This would be a great place to find that person. So these camp meetings and revivals are going to also encourage further movement, more people coming west. Not only now is their land, but it seems like it's an opportunity to create a whole new community. So many people were traveling to these revivals and camp meetings. The biggest ones happening in the Kentucky, Southern Ohio, Tennessee area, but you will also see smaller ones scattered throughout, sort of from North Carolina as far north as Western New York. So many people are traveling to these things, that especially in Western New York, the foot traffic basically dug paths in the ground, and people referred to it as the burned over district because there were so many people moving across that state every year to come to things like these camp meetings. But this is going to be the seeds that are going to create a religious culture and a value system in antebellum America. And if we were going to pick a person who is going to be the person who really sets this in motion, much like the First Great Awakening with someone like George Whitefield or Jonathan Edwards, we see that in the figure of Charles Grandison Finney. He was a Methodist minister who began to preach about this idea that religion is something to do, not something to wait for. So looking for kind of how each Great Awakening has a different idea or philosophy behind it, much of the Second Great Awakening was built around this idea that I had to be a Christian person in action. That's the doing part. And so it wasn't just simply that I'm going to church or going to a camp meeting or attempting maybe to even build a church, but that I'm going to try to put this religion and its values in practice every day. And so we will see it give rise to reform throughout the antebellum period. But it begins with Charles Finney in the 1790s. So the overall effects of the Second Great Awakening is one, reform movements, again, the doing. But we're also going to see cultural conflicts. And one of those cultural conflicts is going to be, well, if someone is saying you have to take certain action in order to demonstrate your Christian practice, and you're limited in certain behaviors or activities because of this, is the reform itself a challenge to democracy? And some of this stems from the fact that many of the churches that evolved during the Second Great Awakening, and even the pre-existing churches that are getting new members, are going to focus on sobriety as a moral imperative. that alcoholism, consumption of alcohol on average was about 8 gallons per person in the United States. And that's every man, woman, and child. So obviously some people were drinking quite a bit. Why did they drink so much? Well, in a lot of areas, water was not palatable. It was not safe. And so alcohol mixed into water. Alcohol was part of the culture, particularly out in the West, and with some of the religious groups and ethnic groups that'll come to the United States through immigration. And so there was this challenge. And for many of these churches, they believed that one of the first things you should do in terms of demonstrating your Christian faith was to be sober and to not drink. But that's a choice, and perhaps that challenges democracy. We're going to see a huge growth in religious participation, and certainly we're going to also see creation of new churches. So the Mormon Church, the Church of Latter-day Saints will evolve in this time, the Seventh-day Adventists, and also a group called the Shakers. So although the Mormon Church and the Seventh-day Adventists are still with us today, the Shakers basically are not. Not only did they believe in sobriety, but they also believed in chastity as moral imperatives. And therefore, their members did not marry, did not engage in any kind of sexual activity, which meant that keeping their membership intact was always a challenge. And essentially, within about 40 years, they had very few adherents left. So let's talk a little bit about reform, because that's really where the second half of this unit is going to take us. We're going to be looking at some of these big issues like abolition, but we want to know the origins of this reform, because yes, it comes out of the Second Great Awakening, but we find those who are most interested in reform are going to actually be people who are still living on the East Coast. Many of them are not tied to the Methodist or Baptist churches of the West or the Mormon Church. They are going to be tied to the old Congregationalist church. And their idea of reform, the way we're going to improve American society, is going to be based on their value system as white Protestant, middle and upper class people, many of whom have some tie to urban culture, college education in the northeastern portions of the country. And so this religion is doing, early on, they're just going to establish what they call institutional charities. Today, if you think about all the different service projects you've been involved with over the years, they started as a marker of cultural consciousness, that you knew there was a problem, you gathered other people together to try to solve that problem. But there was not a lot of charitable giving prior to the Second Great Awakening. You had a few people who had created places like orphanages. Someone like Alexander Hamilton did that in New York City in the late 1700s. But you did not have this idea that for every problem, there should be some sort of charitable organization seeking to solve it. And in this time period, you see the emergence of what's called the benevolent empire, that Americans, if they're doing well, living well, they need to be able to share that and help others. And so many of our reforms actually begin as small charitable projects in a local community, and then in some cases turn out to be much larger statewide and nationwide reform movements. The major reform movements that we'll see, certainly abolition of slavery, temperance, which is to stop the consumption of alcohol, women's rights, and that has an asterisk by it because this was not a popular movement. We certainly can see the feminism of today in the women who were attempting to champion for suffrage and for equal rights under the law. To be relieved from coverture and not having, financial and physical control of themselves legally. But this was a movement that was seen in a very poor light and was not really well respected until much, much later on. A movement that's going to gain a lot of support pretty early on is what we call the asylum movement. And that really takes two forms. The institutionalization of people who may be mentally ill. Until the asylum movement begins in the 1830s, it was pretty common that if you had someone within your household who was mentally ill, they might just simply be put out. They might be basically incarcerated, put in a cell somewhere, a cage, and receiving no real decent treatment. So the asylum movement began as a way to help those people, but it will grow into the concept of just having hospitals in general. The hospital that you could go to if you were hurt, not the idea that you could only get medical treatment if you had money. So that's a very old idea, and certainly one that people have been debating for now several hundred years. But certainly the asylum movement, we're going to see all sorts of mental institutions and care for the mentally ill evolve in this time period. We're going to see prisons improve. So if you've ever heard the word penitentiary, what does that mean? Well, it comes from a religious idea that those who have sinned need time away from society to be penitent, to be reflective, essentially to pay their dues for the crime that they've committed against society. Prison before the 1830s was typically a place you went to while awaiting trial and awaiting execution. They were not heated. You were not guaranteed regular food or basic sanitation. And therefore, if you were sentenced to more than a few weeks of prison, in all likelihood, you would die. What was considered cruel and unusual punishment of the early 1800s was not actually execution. It was being put in prison for any significant period of time. And so you will see prison reform take place in this time, and also the ending of debtor's prison. So this idea that one could be jailed for an extended period of time, or their family members for that matter, because of a lack of being able to pay off debts. And then education. There will be the emergence of what becomes our modern public school model in the 1840s. It begins in Massachusetts. That's where the first public schools are established. But they will very quickly spread. And this is K-8 education. Most people, if they got any kind of education prior to the 20th century, it probably ended somewhere around what we would call sixth grade today. You can see our image there, the drunkard's progress, but that is one of many images that come out of these reform movements, many of whom they're trying to teach people what are the dangers of consumption of alcohol. And so we begin with the man who has had just a single drink with a friend, and then maybe a glass when he goes out, and maybe a little too much, and then he becomes a little disorderly, and then he begins to drink with great regularity and eventually becomes poor and diseased from, I guess, the choices he's made while inebriated. And you continue to see his further and further decline. He's rejected by his friends. And his poor wife and child are the ones who ultimately suffer. And that was one of the things that we do see in antebellum and postbellum America, is this idea that if men live in a very public sphere and have the power of the franchise and money and vote and do all of these things, that they have that power so they can take care of their loved ones. And that may be an infantilization of women and children, but it was the idea that if men had this much responsibility, they needed to live up to it. And they weren't living up to it if they continued to drink to excess. The reform movements are also going to take on some cultural clashes. In particular, the Protestant reform movements of the Second Great Awakening are going to be incredibly anti-Catholic, and they're going to see these Irish immigrants that start appearing on our shores in the 1830s as the antithesis, an actual threat. But they're going to look at lots of other kinds of immigration, especially if it's connected to anything that is a non-Protestant culture, as perhaps negative influence in American life. And this political cartoon, although from a slightly later period, shows Uncle Sam as, running his boarding house. He takes in all of these people from different places. And it turns out, especially this Irishman here, very unruly. and that may be trying to convey this idea that America has been too generous. But that nativist idea, most of our nativists are going to be people who are also Protestant Christian reformers. And they're going to believe that part of their reform is to limit immigration, particularly of Catholic people, from coming to the United States. So these cultural conflicts, they are very much going to be tied to what we would see today as limiting freedom of choice and diversity. There was this strong belief that you had to embrace Protestant norms. You had to be sober. And that meant not just simply not drinking much, but not drinking at all. And so any cultures where people did not embrace those values were seen as anti-American and seen as dangerous. The big immigration that we're going to see in this time period, particularly between 1840 and 1860, is going to be predominantly Irish. Again, coming out of that potato famine and coming to areas like New York and Boston. And most of those immigrants will actually stay at their point of arrival. They will not spread much farther than that. However, the next biggest group to come, which will be Germans, and that will be a sprinkling of both Catholic Germans, Jewish Germans, and also some Protestant Germans. But many of them were farmers back in Germany, and so they will come and want to move west to be farmers once again. A lot of Germans came to places like Missouri, the St. Louis area, even as far south as Texas. You will also see that well-educated Germans who had skills, even if they came to cities, many of them still went out to the Midwest because there was already German communities starting to form in those areas. So you do see a German influence in places like Ohio and Illinois as well. But again, the vast majority of people from these two groups were religiously Catholic, not Protestant. They accepted alcohol, not drinking large amounts of it, but communion with alcohol is part of daily practice in Mass. You're going to see people wanting to build their churches, so the beginnings of Catholic churches in these areas. And many of them didn't want to send their children to these newly created public schools where you started each day with a Protestant Christian prayer. And perhaps got some education about the dangers of Catholicism. And so you will see the emergence of parochial schools. So the Catholic Church, wherever they create a district or a diocese, they began to create schools as well. Catholics at the time also, pre-Vatican II, so before the 1960s, their Mass was conducted in Latin, not English. And most Catholic adherents at that time didn't really have much knowledge of Latin. They might have prayers that they knew and they could recite, but they were not reading the Bible with regularity. Bible study was not part of Catholic practice. And again, that was seen as antithetical to American Christian values of the day. So for white native-born Americans, so people of English or Western European background born in the United States, they called themselves Native Americans, right, back in those days. They're going to see the fact that the Catholic Church's hierarchy comes out of the Vatican with a pope, that somehow anyone who was Catholic was not able to embrace the values and be part of the society that was already beginning to be established here in the United States. Probably the biggest advocate for these Catholic immigrants was a man who also was an immigrant himself, a man named John Hughes, who becomes the Bishop of New York City. And he even challenged the way public funding in schools happened. He believed that, particularly the Irish that he represented, deserved public monies for their schools because the public schools did not serve them. He did not win his argument, but what he did do was basically establish an educational system in major cities across America that to this day runs parallel to the public school system, but on a daily basis engages in the values and traditions of the Catholic faith. So we are going to see white Protestant middle class norms become politicized. So Mr. Haregrove, I know from time to time, has talked about this concept of whiteness. And to say that there are going to be values that become norms and they're going to be based in how what was seen as the dominant culture, certainly the culture with power of the time, saw America in terms of how it should grow and the direction it should move. And so you will see that political parties will begin in some cases to reflect these norms. And where they don't, new parties will be created. So during the second party system, we have our Whigs and our Democrats, but we will actually get a third party called the Nativist Party that comes out of this xenophobic nativist movement. And it is going to do all sorts of things to try to discourage immigrants. In particular, you're going to see at times protests and sometimes mob violence. Anywhere where you had high rates of unemployment of Native Americans, believing that the Irish who could be paid less would somehow take their jobs. You're going to see a lot of publication of anti-Catholic stories, and it will become, sort of the public norm that humor is based upon characterizing and stereotyping Irish immigrants and people who are Catholic as alcoholics. You're going to see a push for anti-immigration laws, which will not come to be until the 1880s. So these nativists are going to be incredibly active in the 1840s, but eventually we will see that their activism will lead to about an 80-year period from 1882 all the way to about 1965, in which there were increasing limitations on who could come to the United States. But they will create a nativist party, and it will be known under different names. So sometimes it will appear as the American Party on ballots. When people referred to it as the Know Nothing Party, it's because that nativists themselves often wouldn't get into political discussions. And so it became sort of the colloquial expression that if you asked a nativist about sort of what their political activities were, they would say they know nothing. And so they became kind of mockingly called the Know Nothing Party, especially in the 1840s and 1850s. But you can see my different poster and my sign here. There, in reality, for Irish Americans, those who arrived between 1838 and the early 1860s were treated as people who were non-white because they were Catholic. They found it very difficult to get jobs outside of very, very poorly paid work in terms of like cleaning, trash collection. Some were able to find work in factories, but typically very, very poorly paid. And many of them, their lives were perhaps not much better than what they had left in Ireland during the famine. It will take generations. Essentially, you will have to get to 2 generations of people who don't sound Irish. In some cases don't look Irish. So characteristics like red hair and freckles and things like that could mark someone, last names. And so you do see essentially after generation, the descendants of these Irish immigrants, many of them will attempt essentially to bring about that whitening that will make them more palatable in terms of American culture. So that's where we will end today. Again, we're trying to kind of open us up to some of the different cultural ideas that we are going to see emerging in this time period. Hopefully you're getting a sense of not only are we going to see art and literature change and evolve in this time period, but also, once again, a religious culture within America become part of its identity.